the Australian Test squad has been announced, and broadly speaking, it's as we expected.
It's unsurprising.
It's unsurprising. The wild thing, Lance Morris is in there. Scott Boland's in there after he bowled the house down last week in a win for Victoria. Green and Marsh are the two batters who will probably be vying for one spot. But there is no bolter. There is no opener there to knock off David Warner. There is no Glenn Maxwell-shaped figure. None of that is going on. This is belt and braces stuff, as expected, as it should be for a side that's enjoyed a pretty good 2023. However, it hasn't stopped a lot of speculation. I was listening to the ABC in my car today. Well, I say my car, my dad's ute that I borrowed. They kept talking about the David Warner decision. That is to say, the decision to play Warner and give him the farewell series and so on. And it feels like, well, it's far more of a hot button issue than I gave it credit for. Or maybe this purely comes down to the fact that Mitchell Johnson has written an op-ed which has been picked up absolutely bloody everywhere.
Well, I can tell you one thing. There were sub-editors and day editors and so on across the country who just breathed a huge sigh of relief when Mitchell Johnson published his column. Beautiful. Here is 3 days of stuff. We can spin this out.
Especially on like a quiet build up to a test.
It's a Monday. It's the week before the test. You've still got a week to fill. There's not a whole lot going on. Like you've got that in terms of international cricket, that interregnum. Okay, what are we going to do? Well, okay, we're going to have a day reporting on the column. Then we've got a day of reactions to the column.
Yeah.
Then we've got the reactions to the reactions. And
trying to get a microphone under Mitchell Johnson at an airport or something.
Well, I'll tell you who has got a microphone under Mitchell Johnson, Bharat Sundaresan, who's recording, has just finished recording, in fact, an episode of their podcast where he's interviewed Mitch about the column, what prompted it, and how he feels about it now that it's out there and garnering a huge response.
Well,
I think
that's savvy from Bharat to get an episode out right now, because that's exclusive content that'll get picked up everywhere.
Yeah, he's had people ringing him all day going, what does Mitch think? What does Mitch think? So I think their episode will be out before our episode, actually. So if you're hearing this, you'll know that you can go and find that and hear from the man himself. But yeah, it's interesting. I've seen a lot of stuff I don't agree with in response to it. I can say that. I don't agree with the central premise. I think Warner's had a long enough and good enough career that as long as he's still available, he still deserves to get picked. But I also understand that other people could think that that's not the case, and I don't think that's a big deal. It seems that in sport media there is an idea that any criticism, particularly if you're seen to be inside the tent still, you're a former player, you're supposed to be, you've got to look after your other people. You can't criticise them because that's a personal vendetta. That's an attack. That's a slamming. He's slammed, all the rest of it. But that apparently wasn't a concern when all of the contemporaries of Justin Langer were getting stuck into the current Australian players a year ago when the coach changed.
It's a fair point. I just add to that like Tim Payne himself this morning, and Payne got dragged into this, the sexting scandal. It felt like an odd way to come at it, referencing George Bailey and his suitability as a selector because he's too close to the players. And he used the example of when Bailey excused himself from deliberations around Payne around that scandal, which is fit and proper, right? That is the right thing for Bailey to have done. It would have been wrong for him to have sat in judgment on that when he's like very close friends with Tim Payne's wife and so on. Like he needed to excuse himself. He did have a conflict of interest, but that is quite an unusual situation where he's grown up with this guy and so on, right? If you're going to preclude people from being in selector roles who have nothing to do with the players, you're going to have guys who are at least 15 years above the age that the oldest player. It's not practical.
But then often the criticism is that those people are out of touch. What do they know about the modern game, how it's played, the modern players? The whole point of picking Bailey was that he knew all of the players from domestic cricket and thus had an inside track.
There you go. So it's hard to I felt like that wasn't that was harsh. Payne handled himself in a quite dignified way on radio this morning. He said that the column made him reevaluate questions around Warner that he hadn't thought about for a while, and that he respects Mitch for having a go in the media and saying what he thinks. But he also said it's pretty clear that Mitch does not like David Warner. And this isn't Mitch's first time around either when it comes to going hard. Last year he wrote that column. What was the word he used for Pat Cummins? It was
disgraceful or gutless or something.
I think it was gutless. And that was the catalyst for Mitchell Johnson, who set up a WhatsApp group with the fast bowlers when he retired. He had a blow up in there and quit the WhatsApp group. This is he's got form. blowing
That's
up
the big thing.
recently.
That's like unfriending people on Facebook used to be.
It is,
It used to be
yeah.
a big deal. You're like, oh, been unfriended. Oh.
Yeah, well, my understanding
I
was
wouldn't have
that,
a clue
from
about
what I gather from, as we do talking to people around the traps, that was the point where there has been this division between Mitch and... I know George Bailey's first comment was, I hope Mitch is okay, right? And I think there is some of that sentiment doing the rounds. Like he does seem volatile, and he's entitled to have his say, but it doesn't mean that that commentary doesn't also get excused from scrutiny in itself, right? Like everything in the public domain is subject to scrutiny, and Mitch doesn't get away with saying whatever he wants and not getting subsequently scrutinised. And I like him, by the way. I've got a lot of time for Mitch, but he now goes through the process of being scrutinised himself in the same way that the team is entitled to be scrutinised by him. Does that make sense?
I don't think he minds that, though. So my impression is, and so the George Bailey thing, and I saw this get reported as a classy response. I hope he's okay. I disagree with that 180
It was very
degrees.
patronising.
It was incredibly patronising.
Yeah, it was suggesting that Mitch is not right.
And Mitch Johnson has a well documented history of trouble with mental health that he's been very candid about, and he's made the decision to be open about it in the hope that that'll be useful for other people. I think that's a brave thing to have done. But he's also in terrific nick. I'm not going to say that I'm close with him or whatever it is, but we've chatted a fair bit over the last couple of years, and he's improved his outcomes, he's improved treatment, he's got better and better, and he talks about that on the show that he does with Barrett as well. So you can follow sort of what's been happening there. He's in great nick. He's better than he's probably ever been, and so that was just a nasty aside from my perspective. I thought that was a sneer. That was undermining what he was saying with the implication that there was some sort of mental instability behind it, and I think that's bullshit.
Yeah, that's Bailey
that.
feeling bruised at the suggestion that he was acting improper around the pain stuff. Like
Right.
he feels aggrieved at what Mitch has said, which I think that hits the wrong note, that line in the column. And it's very aggressive, right? Like it's a very punchy. I sometimes wonder with personalities like Mitch's. I'm not sure who ghostwrites his pieces for the.
Well,
I'm not sure who it is.
Nobody. He's not ghosted. This is the interesting part, right? Is that so? Mitch Johnson does his own stuff. He writes his own work, and from the chat that he had with Barrett, he said he's perfectly happy with what he's written. He said the only thing is there were a couple of kind of, that he made some jokey reference to Bunnings or something with the sandpaper thing with Warner, and he said I probably shouldn't have done that in their conversation.
Oh yeah. That's the other one. I think that with all of this, right, he can have a view about Warner not being right to get a farewell lap. That's a fair perspective, right?
Sure.
We had a conversation about it last week.
Right.
I think it's reasonable. It's a reasonable position that things have changed since Warner made that decision earlier in the year, or at least he stated his preferred timetable. But
and that another player with the same returns over the last couple of years wouldn't get picked.
Yeah, but two things here. Bringing it back to sandpaper, I think misses the mark entirely. The Australian public are sick to death of hearing about that episode. They, most of them have read your book by now, and that people know what happened, and we're so far beyond that. To bring it back and to hook it back to that, I think didn't work, and is out of step with where the public are, I think. And secondly, the Warner, is he good enough to open for Australia still thing? He would have been dropped in England. Definitely would have been dropped in England had he not been doing the job.
Yeah.
He was given...
He did the job in England.
That's right. So the idea that his form, that he's being carried, the idea that he's being carried to the finish line, that's just not what's doing, because they would have dropped him in England. They were very, very upfront about if he had 2 bad test matches in a row, he would go. And he did enough. I'm not saying he blitzed it, but in very challenging conditions, he provided, with Khawaja, a base for Australia more than enough
and he made
to
a big
justify
score
his
in that
selection
Lord's
there.
test that they won, which is why they retained the trophy. So he's
and he played well at the Oval
in
in the final test too, where they came close to winning that match. I know they don't go on with it, but
Yeah.
like his most recent performance for Australia is not a droppable one.
All of this. So basically, the argument in the piece, I don't agree with the contention of it. I think I have a different perspective on it. Fine.
Yeah.
The way that it's been described, and particularly this kind of, there's been a lot of describing, Johnson as being angry, and he's lashed out and he's got stuck in. He's not angry. He's chill. He's relaxed. His perspective was, I need to write a column. I need to write something. I need to have an opinion that I actually hold, and I need to be strong in expressing it. And his opinion is that they shouldn't be picking a guy whose career is all but wrapped up. And
it does feel though there. I mean, yeah, okay, but let's not overcorrect here, Jeff. Like, it does feel like he fucking hates Warner. I don't think you can read that and arrive at any other conclusion than that. And Payne been in that dressing room with all of them.
Sure.
And Payne said that on the record today. It's okay, right? You're allowed to dislike people.
All Payne said was that they're very different people, and not everybody in a team loves each other and gets along.
Yeah, and that's the whole contention of Breding's book, Whitewash to Whitewash, that you can be in the same dressing room with people you don't get on with, but we shouldn't sort of brush over the fact that it's pretty clear there's some animosity there that goes back probably a decade, right?
But I don't think it's animosity that's to an extent that Mitchell Johnson's been sitting there for 5 years going, how am I going to get back at David Warner? How am I going to destroy him once and for all?
Yeah.
He's been asked for an opinion, and he's come up with it, and that's what he's come up with. And yeah, it's forceful, and you can disagree with it. But I think the thing of him being characterised as sort of unhinged or shouting abuse, or, it's not that. He's somebody who said something, and written words have a more potent effect than spoken words a lot of the time. You can say a line, and obviously your tone can indicate that it's a bit of a throwaway line or a bit of a dig or whatever it is. But written down, it can seem much more concrete and hit with more force. So
well, I think
there's an element there.
Well, Mitch went through that when he was on Twitter, right? When he was quite an active tweeter for a couple of years, and he pulled out on all of that because, I mean, he had a strong opinion on everything, and a lot of it a lot of the time it seemed to hit weird notes, unusual notes, and I know he doesn't do that platform anymore. And that platform is a diminishing place anyway. That's not what it used to be for lots of reasons. But what you're describing there, when you write it down, if you say it out loud, it can come with more. It can have more emotion and feeling than the cold words written on the page or tweeted out on a website, as it were.
It's exactly that, and sometimes when the words are coming from you, you know how you intend them to come across, but you can't then understand how they come across to somebody who's just reading them cold and doesn't understand the sort of the emotion or the intention behind it.
Well, I think we've dealt with that fairly comprehensively. Let's move on to the Women's Big Bash League final that was held on Saturday night. I really enjoyed watching this with no work. Apart from having to talk about it here, I'm like, this is quite nice watching a game of cricket with a bunch of cricketers I have a lot of respect for, and
don't have to write anything.
I have no commitments, no commentary, no writing. I'm just watching the game. I sat in the pub. I sat at the commercial club with Paddy and Jono and watched it, and it was lovely.
And isn't it nice when you watch a game and a player who you really like watching does something great and things go well for them and you get to feel good?
It was delightful that Amanda Jade Wellington had this influence. I don't think she'll mind me saying a few things. So she spent a lot of time with us at Fairbrack this year. She was playing in one of with the Warriors team, and naturally, when you're someone who's had the taste of the top, the success that can come with playing at the top level, and being overlooked for a consistent amount of time, you have dips in your own emotions around that. And I think she was going through a lowish period around there. She dominated the 100 last year, took over 20 wickets in the Big Bash last year. The Strikers had won the competition, and she was still seemingly kind of nowhere. Maybe Australia A level, but really not pushing for senior selection, whilst dominating every domestic comp that she was playing in and feeling a bit. And but she's such a interesting human being. Every night when she was in Hong Kong, she wasn't seeing Hong Kong as 2 weeks to cash the check, go back to the hotel at the end of the night and play cricket. She was mapping out for herself these 20-kilometre walks deep into the night and seeing everything. She was the best travelled person in the whole of the competition, and she was coming back at breakfast the next day and seeing Rachel Mean tell everything she'd done, and squeezing the sponge of life to the extent that she can squeeze it. And I think it just is an example of the way that she sees the world. And she's not polished, and she's not that kind of person, but she's bloody enthusiastic, and she's an easy person to like. I was the first person to ever interview her back in 2015, as she often reminds me, in the Crick Info days for you and me doing the Women's Big Bash League. And I wonder whether a performance like this, a player of the match in the final, held her nerve, defended 124, bowled the bloody house down, didn't bowl a bad ball really, and had to reset after being hit for 6 down the ground in the final over. I wonder whether that will provide pause for thought for some of the less imaginative types who seemingly have marked their card because naturally, being a leg spinner, there's a high degree of volatility in what she does.
Well, and I think an important point with that is how often she bowls the final over of games for the strikers and in other franchise cricket, and even has bowled in super overs as well. Your conventional thinking about the leg spinner is that they're volatile, they miss the mark, there's a couple of boundaries in every over, but sometimes they turn one that does some damage, all that kind of stuff. And that's not so much the case with her. Consistency is one of her weapons, even though she's a bigger turner of the ball than the leg spinners you think of as being consistent leg spinners. She's a bit slower through the air and she turns it more, and that was one of the criticisms that they had, that they had to get leg spinners for Australia who were quicker through the air, like King and Wareham. Okay, fine. I mean, well, also you're allowed to have 3 spinners in the mix. You don't have to, just because somebody does the same kind of thing doesn't mean that they should be out of contention. You often have 3 right-arm seamers in a team, and
someone tell those South Africans with the 4 googly bowlers back in beating England and so on. I mean, I know we're going back 100 plus years, but to describe that, but there have been times when one discipline has dominated a bowling group, and the Aussies have got, obviously they're blessed for talent. They win everything. They're not done poorly with Wellington out of the side,
but defending, so they had 125 to defend. They're at Adelaide Oval, they had 12,500 in, so a good crowd. Lowish score. Like when Teen Wolf and Talia McGrath were going along, it looked like the strikers would make a big score at that point. They were 1 for 71 at the halfway mark, and then the wickets start to fall and there's a little bit of panic sets in. Wellington's there, not out at the end, makes a few, gets them up to that. What shouldn't be a defendable score, right? You shouldn't be defending a runner ball in WBBL. That's WBBL season 1, not season 9. And the fact that she's able to hold her nerve at the end, like you say, bowling that last over when she gets whacked for that 6 down the ground, Michaela Hinkley hits her, it just carries long on by a couple of metres, and the next one just falls short at long off by a couple of metres. There's not much in it, but she's able to, with that slowness through the air, to draw those mistakes through the shot. I mean, she ends up with 23 wickets this season, took 23 last season as well, if I remember rightly. So 4th highest, 3rd highest wicket taker in the comp. Yeah, Sophie Day was 27, Jonathan 24. 2nd best economy rate in the whole competition, and that's from Wellington playing 15 games. That's behind Darcy Brown, who played 3 games. Mm-hmm. So, she went at 5.2, something like that, per over across the entire tournament. She's had a blinder again, and she keeps stacking them up. So it would be nice to see, but I won't hold my breath.
I was really happy for Talia McGrath, who was so important when South Australia won the WNCL 4 or 5 years ago, from kind of nowhere to knock off New South Wales, that she's become such a leader and such a dominant force in T20 cricket. That Yorker to knock over Laura Harris first ball to die
huge.
for.
I mean,
2 in 2 to get, and that was the big turning point in the defence of 124. It's when they started putting scoreboard pressure on in the wickets column.
Exactly, and so it's after that opening partnership, that bigger partnership has been separated, because they've got Grace Harris and Georgia Redmayne going along pretty nicely at what they're none for 32 after 32 balls. They're 1 for 43 at one point. They both hit catches, and then it's when McGrath comes in and bowls Mignon Dupree, and then, Laura Harris' first ball, that's probably the most important delivery in the game, because she only needs to face 2 overs to make 20 runs, and suddenly it's a very different prospect. Charlie Knott was impressive. She did her best, hit a quick 20, and Amelia Kerr was just trying to hold things together and bat through the innings, but
barely faced the bloody ball.
I know, it did it there. That was badly managed towards the end, and it ended up being the tail enders facing most of it.
Because Kerr's the one who is well set up to play Wellington, because Kerr has that ability to jump all the way out to the return crease and play from the corner. She basically gives the stumps to wrist spinners and backs herself to hoik it over deep backward square. It's got a great eye, and she didn't get a chance to take down Wellington at the end, because Wellington was keeping everyone else on strike. So they didn't quite get the match up they needed at the end to go at sort of 8 and over for the last 5 or something like that.
Yeah, so they end up, they needed 5 off the last ball after Hinkley gets caught, and Nicola Hancock couldn't do that. She bowled really well too. Took the early wicket when the strikers were batting, and then came back and broke the 2nd wicket partnership when it looked like they were absolutely taking the thing away. She finished up with 3 for...
She looked great in Hancock early on. Gets that ball moving around, hit the stumps a couple of times. She's class.
And Jonathan, 1 for 19 off 3. Georgia Vole, 1 for 19 off 3. She came through in the Georgia influx It was the 2020 WBBL. Me and Laura Jolly were both tracking the number of Georgias. We had 6 Georgias in the 2020 2021 season, which was the most Georges, and I think the most of any first name. And so I remember tracking that at the time. Laura's put it all into graph form. She's got numbers of Georges over the seasons of the WBBL. Bless her.
Yeah, you had Georgia on your mind, as it were. One thing, tell me if I got this wrong. As I said, I wasn't watching it with commentary. I was watching it in a pub. Didn't feel like a lot of people at the final.
12,500.
Yeah, it's okay.
I mean, it's good. It's a good score, but at Adelaide Oval, it
looks worse because it's 50,000. Yeah. I don't know.
If you had that at
Saturday
you wouldn't fit them into North Sydney, but
wouldn't fit them in North Sydney. I don't have a strong view on this. I'm just noting that the AFLW Grand Final yesterday, 14,000 people at Princes Park, and they could have sold that out times over. I'm not quite sure why there hasn't been a similar influx of spectators at the WBBL. There might be an answer for that. They might be getting. I'm sure CA will tell me in a press release that there's been more people than ever before. That's fine, but I suppose we're now benchmarking it not only against previous seasons but against other sports. The Matildas. Again, that was a World Cup, so again, not quite like for like, but still, what the Matildas draw, even in friendlies, when they're playing at home in Australia.
But they play far fewer games.
They play
it's
far
not a
fewer
domestic
games.
competition.
It's not a domestic
I mean, the W League draws nobody.
No, sure, but I'm just making the point that high profile, one-off, big time thing like a final, like a grand final.
But it's still a domestic final, and it's still. I mean,
it's a lot more than what go to the men's, 50 over final. I'll give you that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. Is there a comparative advantage to playing at Adelaide Oval in a situation like that? I mean, there probably is.
I suppose you have to have the headroom.
There probably is, yeah.
Because you think 86,000 at the MCG in 2020, and you think, well, you've got to be ambitious and keep looking up, rather than say, well, let's play it at Karen Rolton number 2
this
and
is
have
the whole
400
thing in
people
England, right? In England, where they for so long were keen to continue playing games at 5,000 capacity stadiums for the women's team, and they've moved away from that.
Because they feel better when you've got 5,000 people there.
Right, but at the Women's Ashes, we were getting much bigger crowds.
20-ish thousand at the T20s.
20 at the Oval, 20 at Lord's.
Pretty similar at Edgbaston, Lord's Oval. They were all between 19 and 21, I think.
And I'm not sure how this would play out with a Women's Ashes match if it were on a Saturday night at Adelaide Oval. Unfortunately, the two at Adelaide
got rained off
last time, so it's hard to benchmark it. But
sure.
I don't want to get too deep into this, but it did strike me as I thought there'd be more there.
Yeah.
My instinct was there'd be more there.
Yeah, but I also look at, how many did they get? That 2009 World Cup final that was at North Sydney, wasn't it?
And that was friends and family only.
But
400 people there.
No, this was the one that did draw a decent crowd at the time. Like, they packed the place out, but it was whatever they could fit in there, which was single-figure thousands.
The England-New Zealand women's final in 2009.
Was it that one, or was it?
I think you might have your World Cup. The one that Ali Mitchell always talks about,
yes.
She did that game at 2009 where it was like there was nobody there. It might be a different World Cup, but still, you're right.
What I'm thinking of is so there was a game, maybe it was the WBBL season opener that they held there, and the contrast was being made between the number had shown up to the same ground in 2009 versus selling the joint out.
That's about right, yeah.
Later.
The opening weekend at North Sydney Oval.
The connection my brain was trying to make.
Yeah, 2016 is what you're thinking of. That opening weekend when they played 4 games there, and it's Saturday night, 5,000 people. It was brilliant. And the test match we went to as well at North Sydney
really
in
good crowd.
2017, got great crowds throughout. Anyway, it's not a huge talking point, but it's not nothing either.
Should we take a break? Because we're about at the time for segment 3.
Okay, then let's do that. We've got heaps more to come.